5 things you can do with fall's favorite fruit. Well, hello there again. I'm Jeff. JR is the producer, and you are ready for another exciting plain English lesson, this time number 308. And that means the full lesson is available at plainenglish.com/308. It's November 2nd, and that means we are in prime pumpkin season in North America. The bright orange squash is everywhere in October and November. So I thought we could spend some time talking about what we do with pumpkins here in the U.S. I got on quite a roll when I was writing this lesson, and it turned into 2 lessons in a row. So today we'll talk about 2 things you can do with pumpkins, and on Thursday we'll finish up with 3 more. I'll share 5 things you can do with pumpkins on today's lesson and Thursday's lesson. You can pick pumpkins, you can carve pumpkins, you can eat pumpkins, you can even drink them. And there is one more thing that I'll keep as a surprise for the end of tomorrow's lesson, or the end of Thursday's lesson. So let's start off with the first thing you can do with a pumpkin, and that is you can pick it. You can pick your own pumpkin. It's a fun fall activity. If you have kids, it's fun to go to a pumpkin patch. A pumpkin patch is a garden where the pumpkins are growing on the ground, and it's popular to take kids to a pumpkin patch to pick their own Halloween pumpkins. A pumpkin grows on a vine. At the beginning of the growing season, the farmer will plant the seeds in a mound of soil, and a vine will start growing along the ground. And there will be pumpkins that start growing off the vine. A pumpkin patch is several vines growing in a garden. You can go, select your very own pumpkin, cut it off the vine, weigh it, and pay by the pound. So that's number 1. It's like a nice activity. Most of us get our pumpkins at the grocery store, but you can also go pick your own Halloween pumpkin. How big is a Halloween pumpkin? Well, they come in a variety of sizes. There are small ones that go on tabletops as decorations. Those might be twice the size of your fist, say. You don't carve those, but you pick them up for $1 or $2 at the store and leave them around your house. The traditional pumpkin size is about a foot tall and might weigh 25 pounds. But of course, you can buy really big ones too. Some can be over 100 pounds. You get the pumpkin home, and that brings us to number 2. You can carve it. You've seen the jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, which are carved and lit up from the inside. This is a very, very common thing to do here in the weeks leading up to Halloween, so mid-October. First, you carve a circle on the top of the pumpkin with the stem in the center and remove the lid. Set this aside, but don't throw it away. We're going to save the lid for later. Next, you'll look straight down into the cavity and see the fruit and seeds inside. This is when you need to be strong. You reach in, and I recommend doing this with short sleeves. You reach in and clear out the flesh of the pumpkin and the seeds with your hands. Fair warning, this is a slimy, disgusting texture. You'll want a bowl nearby so you can put the guts of the pumpkin in something. You'll use your hands for most of this, but when you've gotten most of the flesh out, you'll want to go in with a spoon and scrape all the remaining material out so you've just got the husk, the thick outside part of the pumpkin left. It'll be a strong, hollow pumpkin at that point. Well, now we get to the fun part. You'll want to take a black marker. It can be any color, just not orange. Take a marker and draw a face on the front of the pumpkin. Now, don't get too fancy at this stage, especially if it's your first pumpkin, because you're going to have to carve this with a knife. So I would recommend sticking with triangles for eyes and the nose, and then a wide mouth, maybe with a few big triangle teeth. And now, from the outside, you'll use a knife to carve the shape of the face that you've drawn. The triangle eyes will pop out quite easily. I should mention at this point that you'll want a special pumpkin carving knife. You can try this with a kitchen knife, but I don't recommend it. You'll need a thick, serrated metal blade. You can buy pumpkin carving knives on Amazon that are just perfect for this purpose. Okay, so now you've got a hollow pumpkin with a face carved in the front and a removable lid. The one and only thing left is the candle. Buy a few cheap wax candles at the store. Make sure the base is wide enough so the candle can stand up on its own. You'll put a candle inside the pumpkin and light it. You can put the lid back on top of the pumpkin, the part with the stem. Just leave it a little askew so the candle doesn't blow out. And voila, you have a lighted jack-o'-lantern pumpkin, perfect to display in your window or on your front porch or just in your living room. So those are 2 things you can do with a Halloween pumpkin. You can pick it yourself and you can carve it up. On Thursday, we'll talk about 3 more things you can do with a pumpkin. I'll tell you 2 of them. You can eat and drink pumpkin, but the final thing is going to be a surprise. I live in America's pumpkin heartland. The state of Illinois, my home state, is the largest producer of pumpkins in America, though most of them are for canning. Today's phrasal verb is stick with. There are a few meanings, but the one we'll talk about today is to continue doing something or to not change. To continue doing something or to not change. That's what it means to stick with something. Do you remember hearing that earlier? The standard pumpkin design has triangles for eyes and a jagged mouth. You can't go wrong with that. Expert pumpkin carvers may decide to experiment with more innovative shapes for the components of their pumpkin's face. I, however, am not an expert pumpkin carver. So, on the very rare occasions that I carve a pumpkin, I stick with the basic shapes. I don't change from the standard advice. I don't change from the way I typically do it. I stick with the triangles for the eyes and a standard shaped mouth. I think I've mentioned before that I don't like to drink liquor. I'll have a cocktail every once in a while, but for the most part, I stick to beer and wine. I stick with beer and wine. That's what I like to drink, and I don't really change. If I'm out with friends and someone wants to buy a round of shots, liquor, I almost always politely decline. One way I can politely decline is by saying, "Thanks for the offer, but I'm sticking with beer tonight. I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing, having beer and not liquor." They celebrated Thanksgiving last month in Canada. We'll celebrate it later this month in the United States. In my opinion, there are two kinds of Thanksgiving tables. There are the tables that experiment with new recipes and new flavors, and there are the ones that stick with the classic recipes and sides. I like to stick with the classic recipes. I like to experiment with new types of food up to 364 days per year. But on that one day, on Thanksgiving Day, I like to stick with the classics: mashed potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, green beans, turkey, gravy, pumpkin pie, and vanilla ice cream for dessert. These are the classics, and I like to stick with the classics. I like to continue doing what I've always done on that day, which is to eat the classic recipes. You can stick with a decision. Imagine you made a decision, but now you have doubts about it. Maybe you're under pressure to change it. You give it some thought and you decide to stick with your decision. Some school districts opened for in-person instruction this fall. After COVID cases started rising, a lot of those school districts canceled in-person classes and went back to 100% remote learning. But some school districts decided to stick with their in-person classes on the basis that kids are not significant spreaders of the disease. Those school districts were under a lot of pressure to change their decision, and there are legitimate worries about having school open. But in the end, some school districts decided to stick with their original plan to open and host kids in the classroom at least a few days a week. They stuck with their decision. They did not change it. Tomorrow is our presidential election in the U.S. I am offering no predictions. I can confidently say I would not be surprised by any outcome. I would not be surprised if Trump wins. I would not be surprised if Biden wins. A lot of people voted for Trump last time around. Enough, obviously, for him to win. The question is, how many voters are going to stick with Trump? If enough voters stick with him, he may win again. If enough voters decide not to change, then Trump can win again. We will soon find out how many of his 2016 supporters decide to stick with him after 4 tumultuous years. I just finished a book by the Irish writer Roddy Doyle. My last international trip before the quarantine was to Dublin. That was just over a year ago. One rainy afternoon, I ducked into a cafe that had books on the shelves that you could read as you had your Irish tea or a drink. I picked a book at random and started reading. It was a collection of stories by Roddy Doyle. I wound up buying that book and finishing it after I got home. And I just now read his newest book called Love. The book was about 2 old friends reflecting on their lives over a night out at Dublin's pubs. And one of the lines in the book caught me. It was about aging. The characters were about 60 years old. So here's the line. I hated this getting old, the surprises. It was supposed to be a slowing down, but it wasn't. It was a series of shocks. Not a slowing down, but a series of shocks. I like the way that was phrased. And that is all. That brings us to the end of the first of 2 lessons on fall's favorite fruit, the pumpkin. It is a fruit, by the way. I looked that up. We treat it like a vegetable in the kitchen, and it looks like a vegetable growing on the ground. But in a scientific sense, it is a fruit. That's because the pumpkin is the part of a plant that contains and protects the seeds. So like an avocado and a tomato, it is technically a fruit, even though its flavor is close to a vegetable. Remember, we'll revisit this topic on Thursday when we'll talk about 3 more things to do with pumpkins. Sneak preview, we'll talk about various popular pumpkin recipes. That's coming up on lesson 309 on Thursday. Don't miss it.